Hello, everyone. We are live today with episode 43, and our guest today is Asad Ramzanali. Please tell me I didn't butcher your name.
You said it right.
Asad is a former chief of staff and deputy director for strategy at the Biden-Harris White House Office of Science and Technology Policy (OSTP), and now he's the director of AI and tech policy at Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. Asad, welcome to AI in Real Life. And I'm very excited to jump right into this discussion. But first, if you don't mind, share a few words about yourself and your current or former work, which would be very interesting to our listeners and viewers, I believe.
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all, and I really appreciate it and appreciate the work you all do here to help have a real conversation that's beyond the hype about AI. So as you said, my my background, I recently was in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where we work on a range of science and tech issues, everything from AI, but also climate and health issues. And the Cancer Moonshot was part of our team. So it was a broad range of things. I was there for nearly 3 years. Before that, I spent 4 years on Capitol Hill, mostly on the House side, the House of Representatives, where I worked for the member from Silicon Valley on tech policy issues. I also got to work on the Senate side briefly. But I started my career in the private sector. So I started on the business side of Silicon Valley. I did things like corporate strategy and startup investing and mergers and acquisitions. So got to kind of bounce around a little bit before ending up in my current role, where I get to work on questions of AI policy. And in my mind, that often means questions like, how do we establish governance and democratic control, which is regulation? And how do we think about the future? How do we think about research and development and where things are going? So I'll leave it there, but happy to jump into any of that.
Jump in we will. So why don't we start off from the very beginning, I would say, right? So in our prep call, we're talking about where can we kick off this discussion and what should we start with? And you mentioned, why don't we start with, how did we get here at this point in time today, right? The US is of today, obviously the leader in AI tech and everything else, with, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, around 70 years of research in
Mm-hmm.
the space. How did we get here today, and what's happening as of today, and why, in your view, what's been happening lately with the current administration is not maybe the right way to do things anymore?
Yeah. So I think about four ingredients that I think are often underappreciated for how we got to American leadership in AI. Research, especially the federal government investing taxpayer dollars into research, an environment that was welcoming and encouraging of immigrants. I think about antitrust actions, which is surprising to some folks that I think those have actually helped create the space for where we are. And in particular, in California, the inability, the fact that the Constitution has been interpreted, state constitution, to not allow for non-compete agreements. So let me say a few words on each of those, and then I'll talk about where I think we're going and the current administration. So the whole idea of AI is really a mix of a lot of technologies that start to flourish in the 1900s, modern telecommunications, computing, so many things. But really, the idea of AI starts to happen in the 1950s. Most of that is investment from federal agencies. And early on, it's really the Department of Defense and DARPA, which is a key enabler of so much AI research and development for decades. DARPA is investing in universities and labs. It helps start up institutions. A lot of the Department of Defense does. So something like RAND Corporation, which still exists today, is doing great work as a think tank. That actually spins out of the Department of Defense because they needed another research program. So many of these labs get started. Later on, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute for Health, NASA, the Department of Energy, others start funding research. But when you think about the critical breakthroughs in things like machine learning, machine translation, machine like vision, computer vision, back propagation, natural language processing, all of these breakthroughs and so many more are direct federal funding. Um, so is the hardware and so many of the other software systems that we use, like GPS, radio frequency signal compression, LCD screens, hard drives, lithium ion batteries. All of those that enable us actually using AI come from federally funded research, and I think that's important. Around 2015, so about a decade ago, corporate America starts. Corporate America always had something of a research bent. Bell Labs, IBM, others, but really in when you get DeepMind, OpenAI, Google, so many others start to really invest deeply in this wave of AI. So that's the research prong. The immigrant prong, I think, is underappreciated. This, as I mentioned, this wave of AI really gets going in that like about 10 years ago. In 2017, there's a paper that kicks off the transformer model. That's a paper from Google employees, 8 of them. They're all working in Mountain View, California, which to me as an American, I'm proud of. I'm proud of the fact that an American company with people working in America developed this innovation. 6 of them are born outside of the US, and the other 2 were children of people who were born outside the US. So the immigrant story doesn't stop there, though. You have founders, co-founders, or CEOs at OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Intel, AMD. So many companies have an immigrant at the helm, which is a big deal, or that co-founded it. And that's true of startups too. Something like 4 out of 5 of the top AI startups are in that position. The antitrust history, I think, is super interesting. A bunch of scholars and a bunch of historians have looked at the longer term impact of antitrust cases. So when you think about how Silicon Valley got started, silicon makes semiconductors. Semiconductors are based on the transistor. The transistor is a patent that AT&T holds, but it's forced to license that patent because of antitrust actions that the Department of Justice took in the 1950s. But for a consent agreement, we don't get this version of Silicon Valley in the time and place that we got it. You can find similar stories with the cases against IBM, the cases against Microsoft, creating the competitive breathing room for software, for open source software, for internet companies, and even for AI. And then finally, the non-competes angle, I always find interesting. Silicon Valley gets started because William Shockley, he's one of the 3 people who was the co-author of the actual transistor invention at AT&T Bell Labs. He goes to Silicon Valley where his mother lived. She was not feeling well, and he wanted to live near her so he could take care of her. He starts Shockley Semiconductor down in the valley in 1955. That doesn't happen except for the antitrust cases that allow for the forced licensing. But what's interesting is a lot of people complain about Shockley's management style, so much so that 8 of the original people who started that company left and started Fairchild, a competitor. Later, you get waves of people leaving Fairchild to start Intel and AMD. That's roughly in the 1960s. That only happens, this kind of competing against a former employer. That to me is great. That is how capitalism should work. That happens because in California, you can't enforce a non-compete agreement, which so many workers have as part of their employment agreements. So anyway, I'll stop there on kind of the history of it, and happy to jump into any of those. But I pointed this out in an article for MIT Tech Review of how we got here, to say on all of these fronts, my view is that the Trump administration is going backwards, not forwards, for how we got to American leadership in the first place in AI. Their action plan had a number of great things in it, a number of things that I think are problematic as well, but those are distractions. You have to look at the bigger picture for how we got here to make sure that we're going to maintain leadership, not just tomorrow, but in the long run.
Yeah, no, that was great. Actually, that was a great history lessons. I did not know this fact, by the way, about the Silicon Valley. Now I do. So let's talk about the federal funding and private versus public investment. You mentioned that throughout the years, the R&D sector and all the institutions, they were very much ahead of the private sector and private companies, which is not the case today. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that hasn't been the case for some years now. I don't know, at least 5 or 10 years. Is you used to be institutions and universities that were working on large language models and coming up with new research, the latest breakthroughs in the space. But as of today, it's companies the likes of OpenAI, case in point, their latest hallucinations paper and everything else under the sun. A lot of the times, these papers are just a way to uh, distract, as you said,
Mhm.
drive our attention elsewhere, or just create the news when there's lack of news in the space. But anyway, what do you think the latest AI action plan, the USA action plan, I believe, as if I read it correctly, tries to address this gap between the private sector funding versus federal funding of R&D. But would you agree it's not really doing a good job when it comes to this? Because obviously we need to accelerate and increase funding when it comes to federal and institutional research, which is not the case right now. Where do you think where there could be an improvement in this regard?
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions here. So I do agree that a lot of the funding in AI has shifted from federal investments being the predominant source to corporate money. The latest figures are harder to track because not every company reports in the same way. Um, but it is the case. I think in the long term, we will see that in the last few years, there has been a shift. The federal government is still funding a ton of research in AI. That's everything from DARPA continues to have great work happening in AI. ARPA-H, a healthcare agency that is DARPA inspired, they're doing interesting work on pharmaceuticals and AI. The National Science Foundation is funding a bunch of institutions. So that's happening. But yeah, because of the money that's pouring into AI, so much of the research is happening at OpenAI, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, Anthropic. Um, there's a ton of that has a ton of implications. To your point, when a corporation publishes research, that can have a lot of the same impact that university or other researchers have, but there's other features of it. A lot of corporations won't want to publish the most interesting work they have. And we've already seen a lot of walking back of the openness that AI research in corporate America had as a feature. We've seen that start to kind of walk back a little bit. I think it's still great that many of these companies allow their employees to publish, but I worry about what happens with that when so much money and competition are in the field. Um, so that's one thing. Two, the action plan mentions a number of things on how to coordinate research better throughout the federal government. I think one thing that you may have been referring to is the NARE, the National AI Research Resource. It's a mouthful, which is an idea to pool resources, specifically access to compute, access to data, which are harder for anyone but the biggest companies to access. So even the leading universities in America have trouble with having enough compute to do original AI research. So the idea of the NARE has existed for a few years. It started as something called the National Research Cloud. And then there was a bill in Congress that created a task force. I got to work on that bill when I was in the House of Representatives and got to help draft a lot of that and got to see the actual task force do its work when I was at OSTP. There's a woman named Lynn Parker who was in both the first Trump admin, the Biden admin, and this Trump admin, who led a lot of that work, and I respect her work dearly. That's a great attempt to help universities and others and even startups access resources. It has not been funded by the federal government at the rate it needs. The National Science Foundation and others have done a pilot where they can use private funding, private donations from companies and others to get something good. That's not the same as the scale of what's needed. Um, the scale of what's needed has also changed. All of this happened well before the large language model. The idea of the national was kicked off before the large language model trend we're in now. And so we would probably have to, 10x the amount of dollars we were talking about before.
Yeah. It's yeah, the landscape, I would say the landscape has changed drastically, not even for the past few years. I would say the best year. Let's do the count. Let's start the countdown since January of this year, right? And it
That's right.
keeps changing drastically every day. So let's talk about a little bit about the US AI action plan. And before we started this live, we touched upon mm, the similarities and a few differences between the US AI action plan that came out in July, and late in August, China released its AI plus plan, I would say. China AI action plan, let's call it this way. And there are quite a few similarities within the approach, as well as differences. And we were earlier discussing with you briefly. And what struck me when I was reading a report on that is that when it comes to national security, US AI action plan addresses issues that are directed outwards. And basically, the country is preparing itself for some threats that are going to come from the outside, versus China is directing everything it has inwards. It's trying to anticipate what might go wrong within the country itself, not as much so as it doesn't really try to position itself in this rhetoric, China versus US, as the US does. Probably it's a ruse, probably it's intentionally, because China always plays the long game, as we all know. So everything is just a riddle within an enigma type of thing when it comes to China. But still, nevertheless, can you talk about this for
Yeah.
for our viewers as well? Because it's very interesting in my view, this discrepancy
Yeah.
difference.
So, first, let's talk about what the purpose of an action plan or strategy is. I mentioned that I started my career in corporate strategy. I will admit that that has made me very skeptical of anything called a strategy, anything called an action plan. I think you should look at what people do and less what they say they want to do later. That's important. I'm not saying we shouldn't scrutinize. And of course, I read both of those documents very closely. I I see these tools as, in a lot of ways, signaling geopolitical intent and signaling what kind of posture each country wants to take. At the top level, to me, the difference is, well, the similarity is both are positioning AI as really important to the geopolitical race or competition or however you want to frame it. I have questions about how helpful that framing is, but both see some version of that. And the signaling that then cascades from that starting point, to me, reads as where does each country have advantages? So the American plan spends a lot of time on infrastructure, spends a lot of time on data centers and energy and water and all of the things you need to train AI systems. Um, that's where America has an advantage. Now, where I tend to think that we over index a bit is the belief that we can just train larger and larger systems and more power will come out. I think Gary Marcus, who's a great AI researcher, he's been at the forefront of criticizing the belief that scaling alone will lead to something that looks like AGI, or it will look like something that leads to ever more powerful AI systems. I think he's onto something. He's been onto something. And so that we're seeing those scaling limits hit in some ways. The Chinese plan, on the other hand, focuses on applications. Where is AI going to be used? What does that look like? That comes with benefits and risks and everything else. But of course, that's in part because the infrastructural pieces where they have some weaknesses. The export controls that the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the beginning of this administration all focused on have played a real role in slowing down their development of their AI industries. So that's not too surprising that both want to focus the attention on where they think they have an advantage. I'm not sure either one is right or wrong, but what I do know is that you can look at the action. So in America, there was an action plan, and then there was 3 executive orders. And my view is the executive orders are worth scrutinizing because those are actual actions. The things I mentioned earlier about what the administration's been doing, those are worth scrutinizing because those have real implications. They're not just ideas of what should happen.
Yeah, and some of the names of those executive orders were uh, fun as well. I'm referring to woke AI in this
Woke
sense. Like,
AI,
if
everybody's
if
favorite.
if if nobody is reading executive orders on your weekend days, guys, you're wasting your time.
That's right.
Anyway,
That's right.
uh, let's talk about geopolitics for 1 second. Way above my pay grade, but still, I'm going to talk about it. So it's not a secret to anyone in the space in the AI bubble that open source AI has become pretty geopolitically important, I would say, for countries. And as of today, China is the country that dominates the open source. I believe 3 or 4 of the current Chinese open source models are the leaders in this. What are your thoughts on this? Because the AI action plan as well highlights the importance of open source and the way kind of the country has to go about it versus just keeping everything private and opaque when it comes to the big tech corporations. That's one of the reasons I believe when DeepSeek emerged in February of this year, OpenAI literally weeks later promised that they will release their open source models shortly, and 6 months later they did.
Mhm.
And where do you think this open source race, kind of, I see it as a separate race in terms of just this US versus China competition. Where do you see this going? How
Yeah,
beneficial is it for countries, to have open source and to kind of exert this type of influence to reach as many users, if you will?
yeah. So, for those viewers who aren't as deep on this, open source is the idea that you should have the software, like traditionally, software, the code should be public. It should be inspectable. If some developer wants to take it and what's called fork it, develop their own, edit the code, do their own thing with it, they're allowed to. It's openly published. Others can copy and use it. Open source has a long history in the technical stack of almost all the systems we use. So a lot of the operating systems on this thing, a lot of the operating systems in data centers run on Linux. They run on open source systems. There's so many out there that are critical to the functioning of the modern internet and really a lot of digital infrastructure. In the world of AI, I think first we should talk about what is open source. So when we talk about open source, we're really talking about open weight models. The weights on the model are public and shareable. That usually doesn't mean that the data that something is trained on is public. I would love that. There's a woman named Irene at Hugging Face who's a friend. She published a great paper that does a gradation of how do we even talk about the different categories of open source? What does it mean to be more or less open? So in my view, the debate around open source is a fascinating one within AI. And again, here I mean open weight, so the weights of the model are public. Um, it's one where my own views have changed. So I actually welcomed a lot of the Trump AI action plans take on open source and how they're leaning into open source, because I fundamentally believe that part of America's technological prowess is that we've been the source of innovation. We've been the source of everybody else building on our ideals. So when I think about the transformer model, the reason, as I said earlier, that I'm proud that an American company developed that innovation, that people in America were doing that research, that to me is a source of power. That to me is something that we should want more of. Open source is a way of spreading that, because not only could we be the source of that power if we're advancing open source, and there are open weight models that are American as well. Meta has an important one, but there's many. Um, I think it's actually really important for all of the other countries in the world who want to develop something that looks like use cases from AI, that want to develop applications. It's important. Open source is important there because it begins to commodify. It begins to say, here's a commodity like layer, which is the model, And I don't think models are quite there yet. They're not quite at the fully, utility commodity level, but they're getting there. Most of the developers I know who are building AI applications view Anthropic's Claude, the Claude model series, the GPT series for OpenAI, and the Gemini models from Google as roughly interchangeable. And it's an interesting thing to see the market functioning where small price changes actually force developers to like change what they're depending they're building their systems on. And when you look at the coding agents, the vibe coding models, um, I find it interesting that even in where the language itself, the coding matters so much, you can toggle, you can say which models do you want to base what you're seeing on. You can base it on GPT, you can base it on Anthropic, you can do DeepSeek, you can do so many of them. So I think a fundamentally good thing. It's a good source of competition. My view on that changed because early on in the LLM debates, there's a lot of concern about the national security risks of a model that didn't have guardrails, that didn't have anything else. And what if somebody could develop a malicious weapon of some kind? We call them CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. And I think a lot of those fears didn't pan out in the same way. I still have concerns about CBRN. I still have concerns about what the transformer model generally means for bioweapons and for pathogen development and for so many other things. But I'm less worried about will a language model help coach someone in a way that we were worried about even just 2 years ago. There's other concerns that have kind of emerged. But so in my view, open source is a great thing. The administration's encouraging of it. I welcomed that.
It's wouldn't you say it's akin to having for a country to be dominating the open source space? It's akin to having the soft power, as we say, right? Because the term often refers to the South Korea and its export of, K drama and K pop bands and stuff like that. So when you're dominating the open source space, it's just you exerting this, obviously the huge chunk of those existing models predominantly trained on the English language. So again, it's in the English language and the culture on the Western countries, Western-centric countries, if you will. It's ingrained in those models. So by dominating the open source, you would sort of just spread this Western-centric values, I would say, versus that's at least that's how the US views it as of today. That's my take. That's my take on it. Anyway, that's my personal view. Versus just
I think that's right.
let's not let China dominate the agenda, so to speak. We need to be the ones everybody's using. Is the AI action plan, as you mentioned, is pretty much saying it out loud. The American AI stack. These words have been repeated throughout this administration in different forms and different documents. So let's do American made AI. Let's have countries use our infrastructure and American made AI. Let's dominate this. My question to you is do you think this position, and especially in light of the recent news and the tariffs and the current administration alienating the allies and countries we were on friendly terms more or less with, which is not the case today, would you think this position will reinforce this America first and America is the best and everybody should use our tech? Would it reinforce this position, or maybe it will make other countries think hard on how can we extricate ourselves from this dependency on AI, American-made AI, American AI stack, and just work something on our own, or make alliances with someone else, not to be overly dependent on this? Would it have the opposite effect? Could it have the opposite effect? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like your notion there of open source being a way of exerting soft power, and I think I agree with that idea. I see the bigger benefit though in enabling innovation. So you brought up the tech stack. For those who aren't as aware, there's kind of a convergence of many different folks viewing the AI supply chain as a stack where chips or hardware are at the bottom, cloud computing is the next layer up, AI models like GPT-5 or Claude are the next one, and then applications are at the top. So if you're building an application, you kind of build on the other things below. And the idea of a technical stack is not new. We see this in many different technologies. Um, to me, the health of any one market or the health of the product layer that's below where you're focused actually has huge implications for innovation. So if we want applications that impact people, the First Lady has been talking about the role of AI in education, for example. For that to work, you need a healthy market at the AI market, at the AI model. You need competition, you need prices, you need everything that works well. And to me, that's where open source can have a huge impact, is actually reducing prices, making the market a little bit more competitive. It's a The market itself is actually pretty constrained. It's concentrated. It's a handful of providers who are themselves conglomerates, who are themselves vertically integrated and have their own conflicts within the business competitive lens. Um, all of that creates problems that open source can mitigate. I don't think it's going to solve those problems. That to me is what's most exciting about it. Um, for other countries, I think there are legitimate questions about dependency and everything else. Just like I think we should think about infrastructure from a national security lens, not just in AI, but in so many different domains. We should have national security questions. The CHIPS Act is premised on a national security need, because having semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S., there's a national security nexus. Um, where if I'm another country, I'm probably in the mode of, how do I think about developing applications that work in my economy and in my context? That's probably the most important, and far more important than, do I have my own model? Now that probably changes if you have a language that needs help surviving, and if you want to have more control of what you can do, and there's a lot of reasons to have that. Now, would you go all the way down to cloud computing and chips and everything else? A lot of countries have, right? A lot of countries care about industrial policy, has been huge in the semiconductor market in Japan and in so many other countries. So it's not surprising that countries care about it. But for me, the most interesting use cases, and where I would be focused if I was a lot of policymakers in other countries, is at the application layer, right? Like, what can we actually do with this technology that has an impact on our needs?
Yeah, and that's interesting detail that you mentioned there, because that's what I'm saying, at least from what I've been reading and talking to people in the space, is that predominantly, I would say, Asian countries, South Korea, China, obviously, they are more focused on the application and diffusion part. They're really, really trying to make it as accessible, to attract as many users as possible. And they're trying to find the real use case for this. And case in point, the China Action Plan, they really setting up really, really tight, I would say, deadlines for this, right? By 2030, like 70% of all the users or everything, every agency in the country, everybody's supposed to be using AI by I forget, 2037, 100%. So like these numbers are really, really fascinating to me. And versus the US, at least as of today, the agenda is, again, how I see it, is just more of this, okay, we'll reach this AGI type of event at some point and we'll be the best and the strongest. But I don't know, is it only me, or that's kind of the narrative that the big tech companies are trying to, weave to just justify the all the cash inflow and everything else? I don't know.
I think that's part of it. So in the last administration, our office in the White House, we held a conference called AI Aspirations. And the idea was that we wanted to outline a vision and a high level plan for, I think we chose 7 domains where AI could be transformational, that had public missions. So we didn't think the market alone would go there. This isn't a consumer product. But that the technology could actually have a use case that's important for the public. Think about things like drug discovery, where individual actors in the market alone didn't have the incentive to share data, but there is a public incentive or public need to do better. Weather prediction, where a lot of the data comes from government sources today, incorporating AI models could get you more granular predictions. And so we outlined a bunch of those for that exact reason, that there are public missions where this can actually be a transformative technology. But the idea shouldn't be, let's just make sure every government employee uses ChatGPT. Like, that's not going to get us to where we need to go. There was a recent paper from MIT about businesses who've adopted AI, whether or not they've begun to see the business case pan out. And I think it was like 9 out of 10 had not. I fear that the consequences of some of the states going in the direction of every state employee should be using, AI in some system or another. I fear the consequences are worse, because if a government employee uses a chatbot to develop a public facing document that includes even a small hallucination, that's a real problem. And we've seen, not just in the chatbot wave, but we've seen so many contexts where AI or an automation technology being introduced to a place that had questions related to civil rights or related to freedom or liberty. We've seen so many problems there. We've seen algorithms that are used by judges on recidivism have a bunch of flaws around race in them. We've seen hiring algorithms that have flaws around how they view gender. And that's where I get a little bit iffy on the goal. Shouldn't just be infuse AI everywhere as
Yeah.
if it's going to be some kind of magic. But we should be thoughtful about where will this technology have use cases that have a public interest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to some extent, it's much easier for the Chinese government to just give this order for everyone to, for all the regions and small government, not governments, but small agencies, just to start using the technology, right? It's much more vertical, I would say. It's just you give one order and everybody listens, so to speak. Is you don't really have an option of not to. There's no debate about this. So I don't know. Again, time will tell which AI strategy is the winning strategy. But yeah, it's a really fascinating topic, and I know you have to go soon, but I really wanted to talk about such a simple thing as AI regulation.
Mhm.
So how do we regulate AI? I'm joking, but in your congressional testimony in June of this year, you mentioned that you you were really not waiting for, but you're really hopeful and optimistic that at some point there will be one federal piece of AI legislation that one day the U.S. will just have AI act of its own, so to speak, right? Versus just this patchwork of 1,000+ state AI bills. A lot of them are just you know. They have been introduced, but things didn't go anywhere. So this number is totally overblown. But still, there are a lot of different bills that address different issues statewide. So
Mhm.
what makes you so hopeful that the Congress will, at some point in time, probably
Yeah.
sooner or later, will end up having this piece of bipartisan AI legislation? Because I'm not that optimistic. That's why I kind of just wanted to talk to you about, because from my experience with the U.S. Um, politics and the way the Congress works and the bipartisan legislation is worked on, I'm not very optimistic when it comes to this. So, would love to hear your thoughts on
I
this.
So I don't think we need one singular AI act. It could happen that way. We could do it that way. As much as I think we'll need to target issues that arise at the application layers when we see harms. So an example of this is the Take It Down Act that did pass, which deals with deep fake nudes and the distribution of them. The reason I was so adamantly against a provision being debated at the time that would have stopped states from regulating AI in any way was because the Take It Down Act, when the federal government acted finally on a problem that was destroying so many lives of women and girls who had non-consensual intimate images shared of them. The reason I was adamant that we should stop states is because before Congress acted, it was something like 3/4 of states had passed their own law on this. So states have the agility and the nimbleness to be able to do that kind of thing. It's pretty okay in my mind that when states have a patchwork of how to approach that particular problem, that Congress comes in and says, here's what we're going to do for the whole federal government. This is going to work nationwide. And where a state law conflicts, it's constitutionally the federal law wins out. And so to me, that's a great way of being, where states get to continue to operate in their way. They get to see problems that matter to their constituents, which might be different state by state. The state of Tennessee, where my employer, Vanderbilt, is based, passed the Elvis Act, which deals with, in particular, the harm of AI copying the likeness of musicians. That's because Nashville is the capital of live music, so it matters to the state of Tennessee. Now, am I hopeful that the federal government passes a law? Sure. Senator Blackburn, who's the senator from Tennessee, she's got a federal version of that bill, and that's great. I hope that moves at the federal level, and that's when it makes sense to try to preempt the state law. To me, the questions of what is AI regulation have dealt at that level, at the application layer. I think there's also questions at the model layer, where you have a few states who've introduced what I would call transparency and relatively straightforward measures that have sometimes been described as onerous, but I haven't seen one that actually would be that onerous. But also the cloud computing layer, we're going to have to figure out what that means. And I'm actually soon to release a paper on how should we regulate the cloud computing layer. That's where, to me, a lot of the questions can be dealt with federally because they deal with economic, antitrust, competition issues, or national security issues. And at the same time, it makes sense for states to have to deal with questions like how are we going to deal with water resources that are needed for a particular data center. So there's going to be kind of this interplay back and forth, but there's a whole stack of regulation, just like the technology stack.
Yeah, it's just there's so much to address, right? This technology is just permeating every single aspect of our lives. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to catch up with every single piece of news and latest regulation, but as well as for the legislators and for the lawmakers to keep pace. And you mentioned the cloud infrastructure and the paper that you're working on. I still remember what got to me. It was I believe last year the FTC had this hearing, not even a hearing, but they had this type of online event when they were discussing exactly that the federal government has dependency on some of the big tech companies, which they are essentially providing some essential services to the government, which government itself doesn't have, has to outsource it and work with the companies. But how at the same time do you regulate the very companies that can cut you off and just not provide you access to some services? So that's a very interesting question.
I think that's right. In some ways, I don't think it's that hard. We do it in so many other domains, right? Like in the federal government, are you dependent on all of the telecom providers that provide voice services and telephone services? Of course you are. Are you dependent on all of the vendors that create not just office supplies, but build the buildings, that do the military technology, that do many other things? Of course. And yet we find ways to control procurement, to regulate telecom. And so to me, the question of how do you think about cloud computing, you can treat it similar to a utility in so many other domains. And in some ways, there's a core idea called structural separation of should a company have to spin out or be independent of a larger conglomerate if it's in certain lines of business. I think that makes sense in infrastructure. I think it makes sense that a cloud computing company should not be part of a company that depends on cloud services. There's an inherent conflict of interest there. And so we've done that, and we've done it historically in telecommunications. We've done it in railroads, for example, in the early 1900s, started buying up coal mines. Well, when you need to move the coal, you actually do it through railroads. And so the railroads that owned coal mines would preference their own coal over that of independent providers. And so Congress came in, passed the Hepburn Act, which required railroad companies to spin out the coal mines that they owned. That's a good thing. That's a useful way to think about separating the lines of business that are inherently conflicting. For a long time, we had a line in the sand between banking and commerce. A traditional commercial bank couldn't also do commerce, and we've done it in other domains too, like trading securities and other things. That makes sense to me because we have an interest in the money supply not being influenced by the commercial needs of that entity.
Yeah. Coming back to your uh, congressional testimony, I really liked your analogy to the Second Industrial Revolution and the train boom, and all the barons that were kind of they had all the power, and sort of this railway stack versus AI stack as of today, because you made those similarities. Yeah, that was interesting, and things haven't really changed, as you mentioned in that testimony, apart from the fact that you can't really, there's only one way to use a train, I would say, right? It's just you either transport people on it or you transport goods. But there are so many different ways to use this technology, and that's where every single debate when it comes to regulating this technology is getting so polarized. And during our prep call, you were talking about it as well. How do we, and I quote you on this, how do we normalize this debate, right? How do we, where's this golden middle, so to speak? It shouldn't be this innovate versus regulate debate. It's not zero sum game. It shouldn't be. So how do we really start normalizing this?
Yeah.
Let's end with this simple question for you, Asad.
So yeah, so on the train analogy, I think you're right that it's now easy to look at trains as a simple transport mechanism. Um, but I do think that trains are a general purpose technology because there's trade-offs about should it transport military goods? Should it transport people going west in the early stages of America? Should it transport personal goods? Should a company like Sears and Roebuck that becomes a commercial entity to send things on the train through mail order catalog? Right. So in that way, it's not a simple thing, just like today's large language models. Yes, I can use them to edit my talking points or to develop a recipe. But at the end of the day, it has a similar kind of text or image based digital output, just like trains had a similar transport things or goods or people or um, the normal technology conversation I find fascinating. There's a couple of researchers at Princeton, Arvind Narayan and Sayesh Kapoor, who came out with a paper called AI
Yes,
as Normal
yes.
Technology. Yeah, so I love that worldview. I think that's a really good worldview because their basic premise is not that AI is not powerful. They're not saying it's mundane or boring. They're saying it can be normal in a way of looking at how do we apply policy, how do we apply corporate issues, how do we think about the structures of governance in a normal way. And I think they're primarily fighting back against the view that AI is somehow utopian or dystopian or impossible to govern or impossible to understand. And that's where I come down on no, we've actually dealt with hard problems in the past. We've dealt with complicated technologies that are difficult for lawmakers to understand. I don't think that in 2008, when a lot of the financial debates were going on, that every single lawmaker understood every version of how a derivative works or a mortgage-backed security works. Now, you can tell me, wouldn't it have been better if they did? Yeah, it would have. But these are generalists who figure out how to do things that the people need. And so, back to your question of how do we actually get to a place where we can normalize this debate or actually get people to want to regulate? You don't see a path there. I'm of the view that the politics on these questions shift pretty quickly. As soon as voters start to tell their lawmakers that they're worried about what this means for jobs, or they're worried about the surveillance that's happening at work, or they're worried about the deep fake nudes that their children are seeing online, that's when the politics start to shift. So to me, there are policy questions of what should we do, and then there's questions of political will of how do we actually get those things done. And those are separate but related and necessarily linked issues.
Beautifully said. And I'm gonna let you go on this optimistic note, I would say, because I mean, why wouldn't we, right? It's very refreshing to hear. That's what I heard in your words. Like, we still have agency when it comes to this technology, right? We still can decide a lot of things when it comes to us. We have to live with this technology. We have to work with it. We have to work around it sometimes. And yeah, it's very, very nice to hear that, you're optimistic on
I
this.
appreciate
And
it.
I am very, very grateful that you could make this live today. And I know I have to run, so I'm going to end on this. And thank you so much, Asad. And I hope we'll get to have another discussion maybe next year to see how things are going and who was right or who was wrong, maybe at some
Thank
point.
you for doing this,
But
and
we'll
I
see.
can't wait to do it again in the future.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.